When you lose the love of your life, the world stops making sense. For cattle baron Eli Rawlins, burying his wife beneath their special cottonwood tree felt like burying his own heart. His grand ranch fell quiet as winter snow covered everything they'd built together in 40 years. But grief makes a man an easy target. The Blackwood gang heard about the rich cowboy who'd given up on life. They rode hard onto his land, looking for gold and settling old scores. These outlaws expected to find a broken old man. They were dead wrong. Eli had hung up his guns long ago, but some men never forget how to fight. When cornered in the house where his wife's memory lived, what would a grieving widower do against his deadliest enemies? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cottonwood tree stood sentinel against the December sky, its bare branches reaching toward heaven like gnarled fingers in prayer. Beneath its protective canopy lay Martha Rawlins, wife of 40 years to one of Montana's most powerful cattle barons. The headstone was simple granite, bearing only her name, dates, and a single line: "She made all things beautiful." Eli Rawlins sat in his leather chair by the parlor window, watching the snow dust that sacred ground. His weathered hands, once steady enough to thread a needle or draw iron faster than summer lightning, now trembled as they held his morning coffee. The cup had grown cold an hour ago, but he hadn't noticed. Time moved differently now, like honey in winter. The Rawlins Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime Montana grassland, from the rolling hills dotted with Hereford cattle to the timber stands that climbed toward the Continental Divide. The main house stood proud at its heart, a 2-story Victorian mansion that Martha had filled with warmth and laughter. Now it felt like a mausoleum, each room echoing with memories that cut deeper than any blade. Through the frost-etched window, Eli could see his men going about their morning chores. Tom Rodriguez had been his foreman for 20 years, a steady man with salt and pepper hair who understood cattle and weather with equal wisdom. Jake Morrison, younger but no less reliable, worked the corrals with practiced efficiency. And there was Willie Patterson, barely 18 but eager to learn, treating every task like it might be his last chance to prove himself worthy. These men had watched their boss transform from a hard-driving cattle king into a ghost haunting his own empire. In the 3 months since Martha's passing, Eli had barely stepped foot outside the house. Bills piled up on his desk, unmarked and unread. Contracts for spring cattle sales lay forgotten in manila folders. The business that had once commanded his fierce attention now drifted like a ship without anchor. Martha had been his compass for 4 decades. They'd met when he was still running wild, a young man with more anger than sense and a reputation that preceded him into every saloon from Deadwood to Denver. She'd been teaching school in a settlement so small it didn't even have a name, just a cluster of buildings around a crossroads where the stage stopped twice a week. He'd ridden into that nameless town with blood on his hands and a price on his head, looking for a place to lay low while things cooled down. She'd been hanging laundry behind the schoolhouse, humming a hymn he'd heard his mother sing before the war took everything decent from the world. When she'd looked up and seen him watching from the shadows, she hadn't run or screamed. She'd simply asked if he was hungry. That single act of kindness had changed everything. Over the following weeks, as he'd helped repair the schoolhouse roof and chopped wood for the winter, Martha had seen something in him that he'd forgotten existed. Not the killer or the outlaw, or the man whose name was whispered in fear, but the boy who'd once dreamed of having something worth protecting. They'd married under this very cottonwood tree on a spring morning when the world seemed full of endless possibilities. Eli had traded his guns for a rancher's brand, his reputation for respectability. With Martha beside him, he'd built an empire from nothing, earned the trust of neighbors who'd once crossed the street to avoid him, became a pillar of the community. But prosperity had a way of making enemies. Men who'd known him in the old days didn't appreciate his transformation. They saw his success as betrayal, his happiness as something stolen from them. Over the years, a few had tried to collect on old grudges. They'd learned quickly that hanging up his guns didn't mean Eli had forgotten how to use them. The last serious threat had come 7 years ago, when 3 men from his past had shown up demanding what they called their rightful share of his wealth. They'd made the mistake of threatening Martha, speaking words that no gentleman would repeat in mixed company. Eli had given them exactly 1 chance to ride away and never come back. When they'd laughed and reached for their weapons, muscle memory had taken over. The undertaker had needed 3 pine boxes that day. Martha had never spoken of what she'd witnessed, but something had changed between them afterward. Not love that had only grown stronger, but understanding. She'd always known what he'd been, but seeing it with her own eyes had forced them both to confront the darkness he carried. That night, as they'd held each other in their bed, she'd made him promise that when she was gone, he wouldn't let that darkness consume him. It was a promise he was finding harder to keep with each passing day. The sound of approaching horses pulled Eli from his memories. Through the window, he watched Tom and Jake riding hard toward the house, their breath visible in the cold air. Even at a distance, he could see the tension in their postures, the urgent way they leaned forward in their saddles. Tom swung down from his horse before it had fully stopped, his boots hitting the porch with heavy thuds. The front door opened without ceremony. His men had long ago stopped standing on formality. "Boss, we got trouble coming," Tom announced, snow dusting his hat brim as he stepped into the parlor's warmth. "Riders approaching from the east, maybe 8 or 9 of them. They're not moving like honest men." Eli set down his cold coffee and really looked at his foreman for the first time in weeks. Tom's weathered face showed concern, but also something else, a spark of the old alertness that had served them well during the ranch's early years, when rustlers and claim jumpers had been constant threats. "How long?" Eli asked, his voice rusty from disuse. 10 minutes, maybe 15, Jake answered from the doorway, still holding his reins. They were taking their time, looking the place over real careful-like. Willie spotted them from the north ridge. For a moment, the old instinct stirred. Eli found himself calculating fields of fire, counting ammunition, considering defensive positions. Then the weight of his grief settled over him again like a lead blanket. What did any of it matter now? The ranch, the cattle, even his own life without Martha, it all felt like stage dressing for a play that had already ended. "Boss?" Tom's voice carried a note of urgency. "What do you want us to do?" Eli looked past his foreman to the cottonwood tree, its branches stark against the grey sky. Somewhere in his chest, his wedding ring seemed to grow warm against his skin, a reminder of vows made and promises kept. Martha had loved this place, had made it beautiful with her presence. She'd planted gardens where only sagebrush had grown, filled empty rooms with music and conversation, turned a house into a home. Maybe that was reason enough to care what happened next. "Tell Willie to bring the horses into the barn and stay out of sight," Eli said, standing slowly from his chair. "You and Jake take positions in the bunkhouse and keep your rifles handy, but don't start anything unless they do." Tom nodded, relief visible on his weathered features. It was the first real order their boss had given in months, the first sign that somewhere beneath the grief, the man who'd built this empire still existed. As his foreman headed for the door, Eli called after him, "Tom, who do you think they are?" The older man paused, his hand on the doorframe. "Don't know for certain, boss. But the way they're riding, the way they're looking the place over, reminds me of wolves circling wounded prey." After his men had gone, Eli remained standing at the window, watching the horizon. In the distance, he could make out the approaching riders now, dark shapes against the snow-covered range. They moved with purpose, not hurried but determined, like men who'd traveled a long way for something specific. He touched the gold band on his finger, feeling its familiar weight. Martha's voice seemed to whisper in his memory, reminding him that love didn't end with death, it transformed. What they'd built together, the life they'd shared, the values she'd helped him discover, Those things survived her passing. They lived on in the choices he made, the stand he took, the man he chose to be in her absence. For the first time since the funeral, Eli Rawlins straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin. Whatever was coming, whoever these riders were, they'd find more than a broken old man grieving in an empty house. They'd find a husband defending the memory of the woman who'd saved his soul, a rancher protecting the land where her love had taken root and grown into something beautiful. The wedding ring caught the pale winter light as Eli moved away from the window, its golden surface reflecting not the end of a story, but the beginning of one last chapter. The riders came with the confidence of men who believed they held all the cards. 9 hard cases in weather-beaten coats and well-worn holsters, led by a man whose face carried the kind of scars that spoke of violent years and violent choices. Silas Blackwood had aged since Eli had last seen him, grey now threading through his black beard, but his eyes still burned with the same cold hatred that had made him dangerous 20 years ago. They approached the ranch house in a loose formation, spreading out just enough to cover multiple angles, but staying tight enough to present unified force. These weren't common rustlers or drifters looking for easy pickings. They moved like soldiers, like men who'd done this before, and knew the value of preparation. Eli watched from behind the lace curtains Martha had hung in the front parlor, studying each face as they drew closer. He recognized 2 others besides Blackwood: Cray Dawson, still thin as a rail but meaner than a stepped-on snake, and Bull Morrison, who'd earned his nickname by being too stubborn to die, despite taking more bullets than any 3 normal men. The rest were strangers, younger men with hungry eyes and quick hands, the kind who'd follow Blackwood for promises of easy money. They stopped 30 yards from the front porch, close enough to talk, but far enough to avoid being trapped against the house if things went sideways. Blackwood dismounted slowly, making a show of keeping his hands visible, but Eli noticed how the others stayed mounted and ready to ride. "Eli Rawlins." Blackwood's voice carried easily across the winter air, rough as sandpaper but plenty loud enough to be heard inside the house. "Know you're in there, old friend. Heard about your loss. Figured it was time we settled some old business." Through the window, Eli could see Tom and Jake positioned at the bunkhouse, their rifles ready but not yet aimed. Willie was nowhere to be seen, hopefully safe in the barn as ordered. The boy didn't need to witness what was likely coming. Eli moved to Martha's recipe box on the kitchen counter, a carved wooden container she'd treasured above all her other possessions. Inside, beneath her careful handwriting documenting 40 years of Sunday dinners and holiday feasts, his fingers found what he was looking for, a folded piece of paper she'd shown him just once, years ago, when they'd discussed what might happen if his past ever caught up with them. The paper contained a simple map of the house, drawn in Martha's precise hand, showing passages and hiding places built into the Victorians' original construction. The previous owner had been a man with his own reasons for wanting discreet ways to move through his home unseen. Martha had discovered them during her first thorough cleaning, and with her practical nature, she'd mapped them all. "Getting impatient out here, Eli," Blackwood called again. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Eli folded the map and slipped it into his vest pocket, then walked slowly to the front door. His reflection in the hallway mirror showed a man he barely recognized, gaunt cheeks covered in grey stubble, clothes that hung loose on a frame that had forgotten the value of regular meals, eyes that had seen too much sorrow in too short a time. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, keeping his hands empty and visible. The winter air bit through his shirt, but he didn't reach for the coat hanging by the door. Let them see what they'd come to find, a broken man worn down by grief. "Silas," he said simply, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the mounted outlaws. "Been a long time." Blackwood grinned, showing teeth stained yellow by tobacco and neglect. "Not near long enough, considering what you cost me, but I hear you've had some troubles of your own lately. Shame about the missus. Heard she was a real lady." The casual mention of Martha sent heat rushing through Eli's chest, but he kept his expression neutral. These men fed on anger, used it to justify whatever violence they'd planned. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. "What do you want, Silas?" "Same thing I've wanted for 20 years, what you owe me." Blackwood stepped closer to the porch, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Difference is, now you're in no position to argue about terms." Behind Blackwood, the other riders shifted in their saddles, reading the tension in their leader's voice. Eli could see eagerness in their faces, the look of men who'd been promised action and were ready to collect. "The way I remember it," Eli said carefully, "we settled our accounts back in Deadwood. You made your choice when you decided to double-cross the wrong people." "My choice?" Blackwood's voice rose, carrying genuine outrage. "You sold me out to the law, got my brother hanged, and then rode away to play gentleman rancher while I spent 5 years in territorial prison. You call that settled?" The old memories were sharp as broken glass. Eli remembered that night in Deadwood, remembered the choice he'd faced when Blackwood's plan had gone sideways. Save himself and his future with Martha, or go down with a man who'd already proven he couldn't be trusted. It hadn't been a difficult decision then, and he wouldn't apologize for it now. "Your brother killed that deputy," Eli said. "That was his doing, not mine. Because you fed them information about our hideout." Blackwood took another step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Because you wanted out clean, didn't care what happened to the rest of us." Movement at the edge of Eli's vision caught his attention. 2 of the younger outlaws had dismounted and were moving toward the barn, probably hoping to trap Willie or steal horses. The boy would be smart enough to stay hidden, but Eli felt responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar weight. "What's done is done, Silas. You want money, I can write you a bank draft. But this ends here. Today." Blackwood laughed, a sound like glass breaking in a church. "Money? Hell, Eli, if it was just money, I'd have robbed a bank. This is about justice, about settling accounts proper-like." The outlaw leader's hand moved slightly, and Eli saw the telltale tension that preceded a draw. Time seemed to slow, the way it always had in the old days when death hung in the balance. His own hand twitched toward where his gun belt used to ride, muscle memory stronger than conscious thought. But he wore no gun today, had stopped carrying one months ago when simple tasks like shaving or eating had become too much effort to manage. The realization hit him like cold water. He was unarmed, unprepared, facing 9 armed men who'd traveled hundreds of miles for revenge. Surprised? Blackwood had seen the recognition in Eli's eyes. Figured the great Eli Rawlins would be ready for anything. But grief makes a man careless, doesn't it? Makes him forget that some debts never get paid in full. The sound of splintering wood came from the barn, followed by Willie's sharp cry of alarm. The boy had been discovered, and from the rough laughter that followed, he wasn't being treated gently. Eli's hands clenched into fists, but what could he do? Charge 9 armed men with nothing but rage and regret? "Here's what's going to happen," Blackwood continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man explaining simple facts to a slow child. "We're going to make ourselves comfortable on your land for a while, take what we need, enjoy the hospitality, and when we're good and ready, we'll finish what should have been settled 20 years ago." Eli looked past the outlaw leader to the cottonwood tree, its bare branches stark against the grey sky. Martha lay beneath that tree, in ground they'd consecrated together with their hopes and dreams. The thought of these men defiling this place, violating the sanctuary where her memory lived, sent something dangerous stirring in his chest. "You can have whatever money you think I owe you," Eli said quietly, "but you'll treat this place with respect." Blackwood's grin widened. "Or what? You'll write me a strongly worded letter? Face it, Eli, you've gone soft. All those years playing the respectable citizen, you've forgotten what it takes to back up your words." Another crash from the barn, followed by Willie's voice raised in anger rather than fear. The boy had spirit, but spirit wouldn't save him from men who'd killed for less than loose change. "Boys," Blackwood called without taking his eyes off Eli, "bring the kid over here. Let his boss see what happens to folks who don't show proper appreciation." As Willie was dragged from the barn, his young face bloody but defiant, Eli felt something shift deep inside his chest. The grief that had paralyzed him for months remained, but underneath it something else was stirring, something that had been sleeping but not dead. His wedding ring caught the pale winter light as his hand moved unconsciously to his chest, feeling the steady beat of a heart that Martha had helped heal, and that might yet remember how to fight. They shoved Willie onto the porch steps, the boy's lip split and his shirt torn, but his eyes still blazing with defiance. At 18, he had the kind of courage that came from not yet understanding how quickly life could end. Eli envied him that ignorance, even as he feared for his safety. "Spirited little cuss, ain't he?" Bull Morrison chuckled, wiping blood from his knuckles. "Tried to brain me with a pitchfork. Would have hurt if he'd been bigger." Eli helped Willie to his feet, noting the protective way the young man positioned himself between his boss and the outlaws. Even beaten and outnumbered, the boy's first instinct was loyalty. It reminded Eli of himself at that age, before the world had taught him that honor was often a luxury good men couldn't afford. "You hurt?" Eli asked quietly. Willie spat blood into the snow. "Nothing that won't heal, Mr. Rawlins, but they're in the barn, going through everything. Took our best horses already." Blackwood laughed at their quiet conference. "Go ahead, have your little chat, make your plans. Won't change how this ends." He gestured to his men, and they began dismounting, settling in like they meant to stay. "Cray, you and Mouse take the bunkhouse. Bull, secure the barn. Rest of you, start going through the main house. But careful like don't want to damage anything we might find useful." As the outlaws spread out to claim his property, Eli caught Tom's eye across the yard. His foreman was still positioned by the bunkhouse, rifle ready but outnumbered 3-1. Jake had disappeared, probably moving to a better position, but against 9 armed men, tactics would only delay the inevitable. "Inside," Eli told Willie, guiding the boy toward the front door. "We need to tend that cut." Blackwood made no move to stop them, secure in his control of the situation. Why shouldn't he be? He had the numbers, the weapons, and a grieving old man who seemed to have forgotten how to fight. But as Eli stepped back into the house where 40 years of memories lived in every corner, something began stirring beneath the crushing weight of his sorrow. This was Martha's domain, the place where she'd created beauty from nothing, where her laughter had filled rooms and her love had transformed a house into a sanctuary. These men had no right to be here, no claim on anything she'd touched or cherished. He led Willie to the kitchen, where late afternoon light slanted through windows Martha had cleaned every week without fail. Her presence lingered here more than anywhere, in the herbs she'd dried hanging from the ceiling beams, in the cookbook she'd annotated with decades of improvements, in the careful arrangement of cooking utensils that spoke of a woman who'd found joy in feeding the people she loved. "Sit," Eli instructed, guiding Willie to a chair at the kitchen table, the same table where Martha had served breakfast every morning for 4 decades, where they'd shared their hopes and fears over countless cups of coffee, where she'd read him letters from her sister back east while he'd pretended not to enjoy the gossip. As he cleaned Willie's split lip with a damp cloth, Eli found himself really looking at his reflection in the boy's eyes. What he saw there wasn't pretty, a broken man who'd let grief turn him into a shadow of himself. But underneath the self-pity and the weight of loss, something else flickered, something that recognized the wrongness of letting these men defile the place Martha had made sacred. "Mr. Rawlins," Willie said quietly, wincing as the cloth found a particularly tender spot. "What are we going to do?" It was a fair question. What could 3 men do against 9, especially when one of them was unarmed and 2 others were barely more than boys themselves? In the old days, Eli would have already been moving, using speed and surprise to even the odds. But those days felt like they belonged to someone else, a stranger whose skills had rusted from disuse. He moved to Martha's recipe box, running his fingers over the carved lid she'd polished smooth with years of handling. Inside, beneath the handwritten cards that documented a lifetime of family meals and holiday traditions, lay the map she'd drawn with such careful precision. Secret passages, hidden rooms, defensive positions, insurance against a violent past that had never quite let go. "You know this house better than anyone, except Martha," Eli said, studying the map by the fading light. "These passages here," he pointed to lines that showed spaces between walls. "They lead from the root cellar to the master bedroom, from the kitchen pantry to the study. Martha discovered them when we first moved in." Willie leaned closer, his young eyes bright with interest despite his injuries. "Secret passages, like in those adventure books?" "The man who built this place had his own reasons for wanting discreet ways to move around," Eli explained. Martha thought they were romantic, like something from a Gothic novel, but she was practical enough to map them all out, just in case. Through the kitchen window, they could see Blackwood's men making themselves at home. Two had built a fire in the yard and were roasting beef they'd helped themselves to from the smokehouse. Another was examining Martha's prized flower garden, probably looking for a place to relieve himself. The casual desecration made Eli's jaw clench. "They're not going anywhere," Willie observed, following his gaze. "Planned to make this a real siege." Eli nodded, his mind beginning to work in ways it hadn't for months. Blackwood was smart enough not to rush things. The outlaw leader knew his advantage lay in patience and overwhelming force. Why risk casualties in a direct assault when he could simply wait for hunger, thirst, or desperation to force a surrender? But patience worked both ways, and men who settled in for a long siege sometimes grew careless. A soft tapping at the back door made them both freeze. Eli moved carefully to the window and saw Jake Morrison crouched on the porch, his hat pulled low and his rifle across his knees. The cowboy had managed to circle around without being seen, a skill that would serve them well in the hours to come. Eli opened the door just wide enough for Jake to slip inside, then quickly closed and barred it behind him. The young man's face was grim but determined. "Tom's pinned down in the bunkhouse," Jake reported quietly. "They got 2 men watching him, but he's got good cover. I counted 9 of them total, just like we figured. They're spreading out, claiming territory, but they're not being real careful about security yet." Eli studied the map again, then looked at his 2 remaining men. Both young, both loyal, both willing to fight, despite impossible odds. It reminded him of another time, another place, when desperate men had made last stands against superior numbers. Sometimes they won through luck, sometimes through skill, but mostly through the simple refusal to quit. "Here's what we're going to do," he said, feeling something that had been dormant for months beginning to stir. "We're going to make them regret coming here." For the first time since Martha's funeral, Eli Rawlins began to plan like the man he used to be. The grief remained, would always remain, but underneath it, older instincts were awakening. Instincts that remembered how to turn a house into a fortress, how to use familiar ground against an enemy, how to make 9 men feel like they were fighting an army of ghosts. Behind Martha's portrait on the kitchen wall, concealed by a panel she'd designed herself, waited the tools of his former trade, tools he'd hoped never to need again, but that she'd insisted he keep just in case the past ever came calling. His wedding ring caught the lamplight as he reached for the hidden catch, its gold surface reflecting not surrender, but the beginning of something that Silas Blackwood hadn't planned for a fight. The hidden panel slid away with a whisper, revealing a space Martha had helped him design 20 years ago. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather and preserved with the care of a man who understood that some tools never lost their importance, lay the arsenal of his former life. 2 Colt, 45 revolvers, a Winchester rifle, boxes of ammunition, and a gun belt worn smooth by years of use. But it was the leather-bound journal beside the weapons that drew Eli's attention first. Martha's diary from her final months, pages filled with her careful handwriting documenting not just her illness, but her preparations for what might come after. Willie and Jake watched in respectful silence as Eli opened the journal to passages he'd never read, words his wife had written for his eyes alone. Asterisk, my dearest Eli. Asterisk, the first marked page began. Asterisk, if you're reading this, then the cancer has taken me and you're facing the darkness I've seen growing in your eyes. I know you blame yourself for not being able to save me, but some battles can't be won with guns or determination. What matters now is what you do with the time you have left. Asterisk. His hands trembled as he turned the page, finding more of her flowing script. Asterisk. I've seen the way you look toward the past when you think I'm not watching. You believe that old life was evil, something to be ashamed of, but I know better. You were never evil. My love, you were lost. There's a difference. The skills you learned, the strength you developed, the ability to protect what matters, those aren't sins to be buried. They're gifts to be used wisely. Asterisk. Asterisk, I've left you maps, Eli, not just of the house, but of yourself. Remember who you were before you became ashamed of your own strength. Remember that sometimes good men must do hard things to protect what's innocent and beautiful. Remember that I fell in love with all of you, the gunfighter and the gentleman, and I never wanted you to choose between them. Asterisk. Eli's vision blurred, but he continued reading, finding strategic notes interwoven with declarations of love. Martha had known this day would come, had prepared for it with the same thoroughness she'd brought to everything else in their life together. Asterisk. The Blackwood matter troubles me more than I've let you see. Silas wrote to me twice while I was ill, letters I burned without telling you because I didn't want to add to your burdens. But he's coming, Eli. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but eventually, and when he does, he'll find a man weakened by grief and think it means victory. Show him how wrong he is. Asterisk. A thud from upstairs interrupted his reading boots on hardwood floors, voices discussing which rooms might hold the most valuable items. The outlaws were making themselves at home, searching his sanctuary without permission or respect. They're in our bedroom, Willie said quietly, his young voice tight with anger. Jake's hand tightened on his rifle. Just say the word, boss. I can put a bullet through that window and drop one of them before they know what hit them. Eli closed the journal and reached for the gun belt. The leather felt strange against his hands after months of disuse, but the weight was familiar, comforting in a way that surprised him. As he strapped it around his waist, adjusting the holsters to sit at the proper angle, he felt something shifting in his chest, not the crushing grief that had defined his days, but something harder, more focused. Not yet, he told Jake. They're expecting us to make desperate moves, to panic and do something stupid. We're going to be smarter than that. He opened the journal again, finding the page where Martha had sketched the ranch's defensive possibilities with an artist's eye for detail. She'd marked sight lines, choke points, places where a small force could control larger areas. Her handwriting noted which buildings provided the best cover, which approaches offered concealment, where supplies were stored. Asterisk. The root cellar connects to the wine cellar, then to the study. Asterisk, her notes reminded him. Asterisk, a man could move through half the house without being seen. The attic has rifle ports I convinced you to install for ventilation, remember? And the bell tower on the barn isn't just decorative. It commands the entire yard. Asterisk. She thought of everything, Willie marveled, reading over Eli's shoulder. She always did. Eli traced her careful drawings with his finger, seeing the ranch through her strategic mind. Martha understood that planning for trouble didn't mean expecting it. It meant being ready if it came. A signal whistle from outside caught their attention, 3 short bursts that meant all clear in the code they'd developed for moving cattle. It was Tom, still pinned in the bunkhouse, but managing to communicate despite his watchers. Eli moved to the kitchen window and gave the proper response, a brief flash of lamplight that confirmed the signal had been received. In the growing darkness, he could see the outlaws settling in for the night. They'd built their fire too close to the barn, posted guards in positions that left blind spots, made the kinds of mistakes that came from overconfidence. "Time for the first lesson," Eli said, checking the loads in both Colts before sliding them into their holsters. The familiar weight felt like putting on clothes that had been in storage too long, strange at first, then increasingly natural. Using Martha's map, they made their way through the hidden passage from the kitchen to the root cellar. The narrow space smelled of earth and preserves, jars of vegetables and fruits that Martha had put up during her last summer, even in illness. She'd been thinking ahead, preparing for seasons she wouldn't see. The passage emerged in the wine cellar, then continued to a concealed door behind the bookshelf in Eli's study. From there, they could access the second floor without using the main staircase, moving like ghosts through the house the outlaws thought they controlled. The master bedroom showed signs of rough searching, drawers pulled out, clothes scattered, Martha's jewelry box opened and rifled through. They'd taken her wedding pearls, the ones she'd worn to church every Sunday for 40 years. The sight of that violation sent heat rushing through Eli's chest, but he channeled it into cold calculation rather than blind rage. Working quickly and quietly, they rigged the room with surprises Martha had suggested in her notes, tripwires connected to pots and pans that would crash when disturbed, a mirror positioned to reflect movement in the hallway back to anyone watching from outside. Small things, but designed to create the impression that the house itself was fighting back. "They'll think we're everywhere at once," Jake whispered as they completed their preparations. "Good," Eli replied, feeling more like himself than he had in months. "Let them jump at shadows. Scared men make mistakes, and we'll need every advantage we can get." As they prepared to return through the hidden passages, Eli paused at Martha's vanity, where her hairbrush still held strands of silver hair and her perfume bottle caught the moonlight. The woman who'd sat here every morning, making herself beautiful for a man who'd never deserved her, had left him tools to survive this night. Not just weapons and maps, but something more important, permission to be the man she'd fallen in love with, complete and unashamed. His wedding ring seemed to pulse with warmth as they slipped back into the walls of the house, ready to begin the fight for Martha's memory. The first trap triggered just after midnight. The crash of falling pots echoed through the house like a dinner bell in hell, followed by cursing that would have made a cavalry sergeant blush. From their position in the hidden passage between the study and kitchen, Eli and his men could hear boots thundering across the floor above. Confused shouts as the outlaws tried to figure out what had happened. "What in blazes was that?" Blackwood's voice carried clearly through the floorboards, tight with the kind of anger that came from being made to look foolish in front of his men. "Tripwire in the bedroom, boss," came Bull Morrison's sheepish reply. "Somebody rigged the place while we weren't watching." "Impossible. We had eyes on all the doors." The silence that followed was thick with implications. Eli could almost see Blackwood's mind working, realizing that his prey wasn't as helpless as he'd assumed. The outlaw leader had built his reputation on being 3 steps ahead of his enemies, but now something was moving in the shadows that he didn't understand. Jake started to grin in the darkness, but Eli held up a warning hand. One small victory didn't change the odds, 9 against 3, with superior firepower and no need to worry about protecting innocent lives. But it was a beginning. Through a crack in the passage wall, Eli could see into his study, where Cray Dawson was standing guard, his rifle held loose and careless. The man was jumpy now, starting at every settling board and creaking beam. Fear was a weapon Eli understood how to use. "Tell me about Blackwood," Willie whispered, so quiet the words were barely breath. Eli's mind drifted back 23 years, to a time when silver-tongued Eli Rawlins rode with the worst kind of men and told himself it was survival, not choice. Silas Blackwood had been different then, younger, hungrier, still believing that the world owed him something just for being born into it. They'd met in a saloon in Deadwood, Two men running from different kinds of trouble, but heading in the same direction. Blackwood had been fleeing a murder charge in Colorado, while Eli was putting distance between himself and a bank job gone wrong in Wyoming. Neither had been looking for friendship, but necessity had a way of creating strange partnerships. For 2 years, they'd ridden together with a shifting crew of desperate men, hitting payrolls and stagecoaches across 3 territories. Blackwood had been the planner, Eli the enforcer, and between them they'd built a reputation that made honest folks bar their doors when word came that the Blackwood gang was in the territory. But partnership required trust, and trust was something Eli had never been able to give completely. Too many betrayals in his past, too many men who'd sold their souls for the promise of easy money. When Blackwood had started making plans that included killing lawmen and innocent bystanders, Eli had begun looking for an exit. The end had come in Deadwood. During what should have been their biggest score, the First National Bank's monthly shipment of territorial payroll. Blackwood's plan had been solid, his intelligence good, but he'd made one critical error. He'd trusted his brother Danny, a hothead who saw opportunity in every bottle and violence as the answer to every problem. Danny Blackwood had killed Deputy Marshal Tom Harrison during the robbery, shooting him down in cold blood when the lawman had tried to surrender. That single gunshot had changed everything, turning a theft into murder and putting every badge-wearing man in 3 territories on their trail with orders to shoot first and ask questions never. In the aftermath, with pussies closing in from every direction, Blackwood had demanded they all hang together or hang separately, but Eli had already made his choice. He'd seen something in a schoolteacher's eyes that promised a different kind of life, and he wasn't going to throw it away for loyalty to a man whose brother had doomed them all. So he'd made a deal with the territorial marshal, trading information about the gang's hideout for safe passage out of Dakota Territory. It had been survival, pure and simple, but Blackwood had seen it as betrayal, and maybe he'd been right. Danny Blackwood had died at the end of a rope 6 months later. Silas had been sentenced to 10 years hard labor in the territorial prison. The rest of the gang had scattered to the winds, most of them dead within a year from various forms of frontier justice. And Eli had married Martha under a cottonwood tree on a spring morning, burying his guns and his past together in soil that promised new beginnings. "He blames me for his brother's death," Eli whispered back to Willie, "and for the years he spent in prison while I was building this place with Martha. Was he right to blame you?" It was a fair question, one Eli had asked himself 1,000 times over the years. In the cold mathematics of survival, he'd made the smart choice. But survival and righteousness weren't always the same thing, and the men who'd trusted him had paid the price for his salvation. "Maybe," Eli admitted. "But that doesn't mean I'm going to let him destroy what Martha and I built here." Above them, boots were moving more carefully now, the outlaws beginning to understand that the house itself had become an enemy. Eli could hear Blackwood issuing orders, posting guards in different positions, trying to regain control of a situation that was slipping through his fingers like water. From his vest pocket, Eli withdrew his father's silver pocket watch, a family heirloom that had survived the war and 20 years of hard living. The inscription inside the cover read, "Asterisk justice delayed is not justice denied, Colonel James Rawlins, 1847. Asterisk. His father had been a different kind of man, an army officer who'd believed in duty and honor even when it cost him everything he'd valued. He'd died at Shiloh, cut down by Confederate grapeshot, while rallying his men for one last charge against impossible odds. Eli had inherited his watch, his name, and his stubborn refusal to bend when bending would be easier. "Time to even the odds a little," Eli said, checking his Colts one more time. Using Martha's hidden passages, they moved like ghosts through their own home, striking quick and vanishing before the outlaws could respond. A guard posted by the kitchen found his rifle missing and his bootlaces cut. The man watching the front door discovered that someone had filled his saddlebags with rocks. Small harassments, but each one drove home the same message: You're not as safe as you think you are." By dawn, Blackwood's men were exhausted and jumpy, starting at every sound and seeing threats in every shadow. They'd come expecting to face a broken old man, but instead found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't see or predict. Standing at his bedroom window as the sun painted the eastern mountains gold, Eli touched his father's watch and made a promise to the memory of the woman sleeping beneath the cottonwood tree. He would defend what they'd built here, not with the casual violence of his youth, but with the focused purpose of a man who'd found something worth dying for. The greenhouse had been Martha's private sanctuary, a glass cathedral where she'd nurtured beauty from bare earth and endless patience. Even in December, with snow weighing down the roof and frost painting the windows, her presence lingered among the carefully tended herbs and sleeping rose bushes. This was where she'd spent her final autumn, too weak for the heavy work of the ranch, but still determined to coax life from stubborn soil. Now it had become Eli's fortress. The structure sat 50 yards from the main house, connected by a covered walkway that Martha had insisted upon so she could tend her plants even in harsh weather. What the outlaws didn't know was that the walkway concealed another of the ranch's hidden passages, this one leading directly to the root cellar where supplies had been stored against exactly this kind of siege. Jake had taken a bullet in the shoulder during their dawn raid on the outlaws' supplies, nothing fatal but enough to slow him down. Willie was binding the wound with strips torn from one of Martha's gardening aprons, his young hands steady despite the circumstances. "Barely a scratch," Jake insisted through gritted teeth, though the pale set of his features suggested otherwise. "I've had worse from ornery cattle." Through the greenhouse's frosted glass, Eli could see Blackwood's men regrouping around their fire. They'd lost their enthusiasm for casual looting after discovering that 3 of their horses had been set loose during the night and their food supplies had been contaminated with a mixture of salt and soap. Small victories, but each one cost them something: confidence, supplies, the certainty that they held all the advantages. "They're getting frustrated," Willie observed, watching the outlaws argue among themselves. "Some of them want to just burn us out and be done with it." Eli nodded, having reached the same conclusion. Blackwood was smart enough to know that patience favored the defenders, but his men were hired guns who'd signed on for quick money, not an extended siege. The longer this dragged on, the more likely they were to make the kind of desperate mistake that could shift the balance. From his position among Martha's potted herbs, Eli found himself surrounded by the tools of her craft: pruning shears, trowels, watering cans, everything she'd needed to create beauty in a harsh land. It struck him as fitting somehow that he was making his stand here, in the place where she'd fought her own battles against drought and frost and the endless indifference of nature. A memory surfaced unbidden. Martha kneeling among her tomato plants the summer before her illness, her hair silver bright in the morning sun, as she explained to Willie how to tell when the fruit was perfectly ripe. Asterisk. "Everything has its season." Asterisk, she'd said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd learned to read the subtle signs that separated success from failure. Asterisk. "The trick is knowing when to be patient and when to act." Asterisk. The greenhouse door opened with the softest whisper of hinges, and Tom Rodriguez slipped inside like smoke given human form. Despite being in his 50s, the foreman moved with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his life in dangerous country, reading sign and staying alert. "Followed the drainage ditch from the bunkhouse," Tom reported quietly, settling beside them with his back to a support beam. "They've got 2 men watching the approach, but they're more worried about staying warm than staying vigilant." Eli felt a surge of satisfaction at seeing his oldest ally safe. Tom had been with the ranch almost since the beginning, had watched it grow from a modest spread into one of Montana's most successful operations. More than that, he'd been Martha's friend, the man who'd brought her wildflowers when Eli had been too busy with business to notice what she needed. "How's the situation out there?" Eli asked. "Getting uglier by the hour. They killed 3 more of our cattle just for spite. Left the carcasses where we'd have to see them. Blackwood's trying to keep his boys in line, but some of them are getting ideas about what they'd like to do to this place. Through the glass walls, they could see smoke rising from the Outlaws' fire, thick and black against the winter sky. The smell carried hints of burning leather and wood. They were feeding Martha's garden furniture to the flames, destroying beauty for the simple pleasure of destruction. "There's something else," Tom continued, his weathered features troubled. "Heard them talking about the town. They're thinking of riding into Cedar Falls, making some noise, maybe taking hostages to force your hand." The words hit Eli like a physical blow. Cedar Falls was where Martha had done her shopping, where she'd taught Sunday school and organized charity drives for families hit by bad weather or worse luck. The people there were decent folks who'd never done harm to anyone, who'd shown nothing but kindness to the woman Eli had loved. "When?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Tomorrow morning, if we don't surrender by dawn. Blackwood figures you'll trade yourself for their safety." Willie looked up from Jake's bandaged shoulder, his young face hard with determination. "We can't let that happen." "We won't," Eli promised, though he wasn't sure yet how he'd keep that promise. 3 men against 9 was one thing when you had defensive positions and familiar ground. But protecting an entire town required resources they simply didn't possess. Tom must have seen the calculation in his boss's eyes. "There might be another way," he said carefully. "Some of the boys from neighboring spreads have been asking questions, wondering if you need help, words getting around about what's happening here." The possibility sparked something in Eli's chest, hope. Maybe, or just the recognition that they weren't as alone as he'd believed. The network of ranchers and cowboys who'd worked together during roundups and fought side by side against rustlers wouldn't abandon one of their own without a fight. But help would take time to arrive, and Blackwood's patience was wearing thin. They needed something to buy those crucial hours, something that would keep the Outlaws focused on the ranch instead of expanding their campaign of terror. Eli stood and moved to Martha's workbench, where her collection of garden tools lay arranged with military precision. Pruning shears, hand cultivators, a small but wickedly sharp knife she'd used for grafting roses, instruments of creation that could serve other purposes when necessary. "Martha always said everything had its season," he murmured, running his fingers over the tools she'd used to coax life from reluctant soil. "Maybe it's time we reminded Blackwood that some seasons are for planting and others are for reaping what you've sown." His wedding ring caught the pale light filtering through frost-etched glass as he began planning their next move. Outside, the Outlaws continued their casual destruction, unaware that the broken old man they'd come to collect was remembering how to be dangerous. In the distance, the cottonwood tree stood guard over Martha's grave, its bare branches reaching toward a sky that promised snow before nightfall. Soon, this hallowed ground would see the kind of violence Eli had hoped to leave in the past. But some fights couldn't be avoided, and some debts could only be paid in full. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke just after sunset, driving snow horizontally across the ranch with the fury of nature unleashed. Inside the greenhouse, the sound of wind against glass created an eerie symphony that seemed to echo the violence brewing in men's hearts. Eli was studying Martha's garden plans, looking for defensive advantages he might have missed, when Willie's sharp intake of breath drew his attention. The boy was peering through a gap in the frost, his face pale with sudden understanding. "Mr. Rawlins," Willie said quietly, "I think you need to see this." Through the swirling snow, illuminated by the Outlaw's fire, they could make out Blackwood examining something he'd pulled from his saddlebags. Even at this distance, the yellowed paper was unmistakable, a wanted poster, old but still legible, with a face that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the man now watching from the shadows of Martha's greenhouse. But it was the name printed beneath that face that made Eli's blood run cold. Asterisk, wanted for murder and robbery, the Phantom of Deadwood Canyon, $5,000 reward, dead or alive. Asterisk. "That's you," Tom said. "Not a question, but a statement of fact." The foreman had served in the territories during the Indian Wars, had seen enough wanted posters to recognize the distinctive style of the old territorial marshal's office. Eli closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 23 years pressing down on him like the winter storm. The Phantom of Deadwood Canyon, a name he'd hoped was buried as deep as the men who'd earned it. But the past had a way of refusing to stay buried, especially when men like Silas Blackwood had long memories and patient hearts. "I thought they'd all been destroyed," he murmured, remembering the territorial governor's promise when he'd agreed to testify against the Blackwood gang. Complete amnesty, a clean slate, all records sealed. But some documents had a way of surviving, hidden in private collections or forgotten filing cabinets until someone with the right connections decided to dig them up. Jake, despite his wounded shoulder, managed a weak grin. "The Phantom? Hell, boss, no wonder you never talked about the old days. You were famous." Famous wasn't the word Eli would have chosen. Infamous, maybe, or notorious. The Phantom of Deadwood Canyon had been the ghost that had haunted the nightmares of every outlaw, lawman, and honest citizen across 3 territories. A killer so fast with his guns that men swore he had to be supernatural, so cunning in his tactics that entire posses had vanished without a trace while hunting him. The truth was simpler and more terrible. He'd been very good at killing people, and he'd done it without conscience or regret for 3 bloody years before Martha had shown him another way to live. Outside, they could hear Blackwood's voice carrying over the storm, reading portions of the wanted poster to his men. The description was thorough and damning. Asterisk. Subject is believed responsible for 27 confirmed deaths, including 4 peace officers. Known for exceptional speed with firearms and tactical brilliance in asymmetric warfare. Approaches with extreme caution. Subject has never been taken alive. Asterisk. 27, Willie whispered, his young voice carrying a mixture of awe and something that might have been fear. "You killed 27 men?" "More," Eli admitted, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "That poster was 3 years old when they printed it. By the time I met Martha, the count was closer to 40. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the wind and the distant sound of Blackwood's laughter. Even Tom, who'd known him longer than anyone except Martha, was staring at him with new eyes. Eyes that saw not the grieving widower or the successful rancher, but the legend whose name had once been spoken in the same breath as the devil himself. "They were all bad men," Eli said quietly, though he knew it sounded like an excuse even to his own ears. "Killers, rapists, men who preyed on the innocent. I was a bounty hunter, mostly, working for territorial judges who needed problems solved quietly." It was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Some of those 40 men had died because they'd been in his way, or because they'd known too much, or simply because killing had become easier than thinking about alternatives. The Phantom had been a creature of violence, born from war and shaped by a world where strength was the only law that mattered. But Martha had seen something else in him, something worth saving. She'd looked past the blood and the reputation and found a man who'd lost his way, not his soul. Under her influence, he'd learned to value life instead of taking it, to build instead of destroy, to become someone worthy of the love she'd offered so freely. "Does it matter?" Tom asked suddenly, his weathered features thoughtful. "I mean, who you were 20 years ago, does it change who you've been since then?" It was a fair question, one that cut to the heart of everything Eli had struggled with since Martha's death. Was redemption possible for someone who'd done the things he'd done? Could 20 years of decent living balance the scales against 20 years of violence? Through the frosted glass, they could see the effect the revelation was having on Blackwood's men. Some looked excited, energized by the prospect of facing a living legend, but others appeared nervous, uncertain whether the money was worth tangling with someone whose reputation had grown to mythic proportions. "They're scared," Jake observed with satisfaction. "Half of them are probably thinking about riding out before this gets ugly." But Blackwood himself seemed anything but frightened. If anything, the discovery of Eli's true identity had energized him, given him a focus for the rage he'd carried for 2 decades. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about proving himself against the most dangerous man the territories had ever produced. Eli opened Martha's family Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside, pressed between the pages of Psalms, were the flowers from her wedding bouquet, roses and baby's breath, carefully preserved and still carrying the faintest hint of fragrance after 40 years. She'd told him once that she'd kept them as a reminder that beautiful things could survive even the harshest conditions, that love could endure beyond the moment of its creation. Now, looking at those dried petals, he understood what she'd really been saying, that people could change, that the past didn't have to define the future, that redemption was always possible for those willing to fight for it. "You're right, Tom," he said finally. "It doesn't change who I've been, but it might change what I'm capable of becoming again." Outside, Blackwood was shouting orders, his voice carrying clearly over the storm. The outlaws were moving with new purpose, taking positions around the greenhouse, cutting off escape routes they'd previously ignored. The discovery of Eli's identity had changed the rules of engagement. This was no longer a simple shakedown of a grieving rancher. This was a chance to collect one of the biggest bounties in territorial history. "They're going to rush us," Tom said, checking his rifle with the calm efficiency of a man who'd faced long odds before. Eli nodded, feeling the familiar cold settling into his bones, not the cold of winter, but the icy clarity that had once made him the most feared man in 3 territories. For 20 years, he'd been Eli Rawlins, loving husband and successful rancher. But if Blackwood wanted to face the phantom of Deadwood Canyon, then maybe it was time to give him exactly what he'd asked for. His wedding ring seemed to pulse with warmth as he checked his Colts, its gold surface reflecting not condemnation, but permission. Martha had known who he'd been, had loved him not despite his past, but because of his capacity to change. Now, in defense of everything she'd held sacred, he would become that man again, not the killer he'd once been, but the protector he'd learned to be. The storm howled around the greenhouse like a living thing, but inside, surrounded by the tools and memories of the woman who'd saved his soul, Eli Rawlins prepared to fight his last battle as the legend he'd tried so hard to leave behind. The storm raged through the night with biblical fury, as if the heavens themselves were preparing the stage for what was to come. By dawn, the snow had stopped, leaving behind a crystalline world where every surface gleamed like polished silver, and the air carried the kind of clarity that made distant objects seem close enough to touch. Eli stood in the greenhouse among Martha's sleeping plants, methodically checking his weapons with the ritual precision of a man preparing for communion. The Colts felt different in his hands, now not foreign, as they had for so many years, but like instruments returning to a master musician. Each cylinder turned with oiled perfection, each hammer fell with the precise weight he remembered. 20 years might have passed, but some skills were written in bone and sinew, impossible to forget completely. "You sure about this plan?" Tom asked, though his voice carried more concern than doubt. The foreman had spent the night watching their boss transform from grief-stricken widower back into something that resembled the legend on that wanted poster. Eli smiled, and for the first time in months it reached his eyes. Martha was always the one with the real strategic mind. "I just followed her plans and tried not to get anyone killed." From Martha's cedar chest, preserved with the same care she'd given everything else precious in their life, he'd retrieved his wedding outfit, the black suit he'd worn when they'd spoken their vows beneath the cottonwood tree, the white shirt she'd pressed with her own hands, the string tie that had belonged to his father. If he was going to face his past, he would do it dressed as the man she'd helped him become. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the hollow-eyed widower who'd shuffled through the ranch house like a ghost. In his place stood someone who carried himself with the controlled grace of a predator, every movement economical and purposeful. The grief remained, would always remain, but it had been forged into something harder, more focused. Willie watched this metamorphosis with the fascination of youth encountering legend made flesh. Is it true what they said on that poster, about you never being taken alive? They never tried hard enough, Eli replied, adjusting his gun belt to the exact position muscle memory demanded. Most lawmen who came after me were honest men, doing an honest job. I respected that, tried not to kill them unless they forced my hand. But men like Blackwood men who hurt innocents for pleasure, they got different treatment. Through the frost-etched windows, they could see the outlaws taking positions around the ranch buildings. Blackwood had used the night well, studying the terrain and calculating angles of attack. He was no fool, whatever else might be said about him. The man who'd survived 20 years in prison and built a new gang afterward understood the value of preparation. Jake, his wounded arm bound tight against his chest, pointed toward the main house. "They're in your parlor, boss. Can see them through the front window." It was a violation that cut deeper than theft or vandalism. These men in the room where Martha had served tea to visiting ladies, where she'd read her books and planned her gardens, where they'd spent countless quiet evenings simply being content in each other's company. Some desecrations demanded response, regardless of tactical considerations. "Time to even the odds," Eli said, reaching into the cedar chest one final time. Martha's wedding dress lay folded in tissue paper, preserved as carefully as a relic. Beneath it, wrapped in oiled silk, were items that spoke to her deeper understanding of the man she'd married. A set of throwing knives, perfectly balanced and honed to surgical sharpness. A derringer, small enough to conceal but deadly at close range. And strangest of all, a letter in her careful handwriting, addressed simply to "My Phantom." Asterisk, "My dearest love," asterisk, the letter began. Asterisk, "If you're reading this, then our greatest fear has come to pass, and you're facing the choice between the man you were and the man you've become. I want you to know that I never feared the Phantom. I fell in love with him, just as I fell in love with the rancher, the husband, the gentle soul who read me poetry on Sunday mornings." Asterisk, asterisk. "You think your past is something to be ashamed of, but I've always known better. You were never evil, just lost. The skills you learned, the reputation you earned, they weren't sins to be buried, but gifts to be used wisely. Some men are called to build, others to protect what has been built. You've done both, and I've never been prouder of anyone in my life." Asterisk, asterisk. "When this is over, and it will be over, because you're stronger than you know, remember that love doesn't end with death. It transforms, becomes something new and beautiful. Let me transform too, from the woman who held you back from violence to the woman who gives you permission to do what needs doing." Asterisk, asterisk. "Fight for our home, our memory, our love. Fight as the Phantom when you need to, and as Eli Rawlins when you can. Fight, my darling, and know that I'll be watching from beneath our tree, proud of every choice you make. Asterisk, asterisk. All my love, always and forever, Martha, asterisk." Eli read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in his vest pocket, close to his heart. Even in death, she continued to surprise him with her wisdom and her understanding. She'd known this day would come, had prepared for it as thoroughly as she'd prepared for everything else that mattered. "Boss," Tom said urgently, "riders coming up the valley road. Looks like maybe a dozen of them." Through the greenhouse's eastern windows, they could make out the approaching column men on horseback, moving with the steady purpose of those who'd ridden hard through the night. For a moment, hope flared in Eli's chest. Help from neighboring ranches, perhaps, or a territorial marshal's posse responding to reports of trouble. But as the riders drew closer, his hope died. These weren't lawmen or cowboys coming to lend a hand. They were more of Blackwood's kind, hard men with dead eyes and quick guns, attracted by word of a legendary bounty waiting to be collected. "Reinforcements," Jake said grimly. "That poster must have spread faster than we thought. 21 against 4 now, with one of their number wounded and another barely old enough to shave." The mathematics of survival had shifted decisively against them, but Eli found himself oddly at peace with the development. Sometimes a man's fate was written in stars too distant to change, and all he could do was meet it with dignity and purpose. "New plan?" he announced, surprising his men with the calm certainty in his voice. "Tom, I want you to take Willie and head for town. Warn them what's coming. Help them prepare defenses." "Like hell," Tom replied immediately. "We started this together. We'll finish it together. This isn't a discussion, it's an order. Martha loved those people in Cedar Falls, and I won't see them hurt because of my past." Willie stepped forward, his young face set with determination that reminded Eli painfully of himself at that age. "With respect, sir, you can't order me to abandon the man who gave me a chance when no one else would. My father was a drunk and a coward. You showed me what it meant to be something better." Jake nodded agreement despite the pain obvious in his pale features. "Besides, boss, you think the Phantom of Deadwood Canyon needs 3 ranch hands to watch his back. Hell, from what I've heard, you used to take on whole gangs by yourself." Eli looked at their faces, weathered by hard work and honest living, marked by loyalty that couldn't be bought or broken. These were the kind of men Martha had loved, the kind who'd made their ranch feel like home instead of just property. If they wanted to stand with him in this final accounting, then he'd be honored by their company. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this smart. Martha's way, not the old way." He spread her garden plans across the workbench, pointing out positions and fields of fire with the tactical eye that had once made him the most feared man in 3 territories. The greenhouse would be their fort, the covered walkway their escape route, the main house their final battleground if it came to that. They'll expect the Phantom to charge straight at them, guns blazing like something from a dime novel, Eli explained. "Instead, we're going to be patient. Let them come to us, make them pay for every foot of ground." As the sun climbed higher, burning away the last wisps of storm clouds, the opposing forces took their positions across the ranch. Martha had made beautiful. In the distance, the cottonwood tree stood guardian over her grave, its bare branches reaching toward a sky that promised either redemption or reckoning. Eli Rawlins adjusted his father's watch chain and checked his wedding ring one final time, then stepped out of the greenhouse to face whatever judgment awaited. Behind him, 3 good men followed, ready to stand against impossible odds for the simple reason that some things were worth dying for. The Phantom of Deadwood Canyon had returned, but he would fight this last battle not as the killer he'd once been, but as the protector Martha had taught him to become. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Eli stepped into the open ground between the greenhouse and the main house. Behind him, Tom, Jake, and Willie took their positions according to the plan Martha's strategic mind had helped him devise. The air was so still that the crunch of snow beneath his boots seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains. 21 outlaws faced him across the pristine white expanse, some mounted, others positioned behind cover, all of them focused on the man in the black wedding suit who'd walked calmly into their killing ground. At their center stood Silas Blackwood, his weathered face split by a grin that held no warmth, his hand resting on the grip of a gun that had ended more lives than he could probably remember. "Well, well," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying easily in the crisp air. "The Phantom of Deadwood Canyon himself, dressed up like he's going to church. Figured you'd come out shooting, like the old days." Eli stopped 30 yards from the main house porch, close enough to talk without shouting, but far enough to give himself room to move when the talking ended. His right hand hung loose at his side, seemingly casual, but positioned exactly where muscle memory demanded for the fastest possible draw. "Morning, Silas," he replied conversationally, as if they were meeting for coffee instead of a gunfight. Been thinking about what you said yesterday, about settling old accounts. Have you now? Blackwood's grin widened, showing teeth yellowed by tobacco and neglect. Come to your senses. Realized you can't run from the past forever? Behind the outlaw leader, Eli could see the newer arrivals studying him with the hungry fascination of men who'd heard legends but never expected to see one in flesh and blood. The Phantom's reputation had grown over the years, fed by dime novels and campfire stories, until the truth had been buried beneath layers of myth. Some of these men probably expected him to be 10 feet tall and breathing fire. The past has a way of catching up with all of us, Eli agreed, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who'd made peace with whatever was coming. Question is, what do we do when it does? From his vest pocket, he withdrew his father's silver watch, checking the time with deliberate care. 9:15 in the morning, on a Tuesday in December, in the year of our Lord 1893. If these were to be his final moments, he wanted to remember exactly when they occurred. Mighty calm for a man facing down 21 guns, observed Bull Morrison, speaking from his position by the barn door. I've faced worse odds, Eli replied, truthfully. Besides, it's not about the numbers. It's about being willing to pay the price for what matters most. His original Colt .45 rested in its holster like a sleeping serpent, its weight as familiar as his own heartbeat. The weapon had been custom-made by a gunsmith in Denver who'd understood that for some men, a gun was more than a tool. It was an extension of their will, their identity, their very soul. 23 years it had rested unused, but steel didn't forget any more than the man who wielded it. You killed my brother, Blackwood said, his jovial tone finally cracking to reveal the hatred beneath. Sent him to the gallows because you wanted to play house with your schoolmarm. Your brother killed a deputy who was trying to surrender, Eli corrected gently. That put a rope around his neck long before I ever made a choice. I just decided I wasn't going to swing beside him for something he did. The words hit their target. Blackwood's face darkened, his hand tightening on his gun butt. Around him, his men shifted restlessly, reading the tension in their leader's posture and preparing for violence. Always had an answer for everything, didn't you? Blackwood snarled. Always knew how to make yourself look like the reasonable one, while better men paid the price for your decisions. Better men? Eli's voice remained calm, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Danny shot an unarmed lawman in the back because he was scared and stupid. You robbed widows and orphans because it was easier than honest work. Don't talk to me about better men. The first shot came from Cray Dawson, positioned behind a water trough near the bunkhouse. It was a good shot, aimed center mass where any reasonable man would be standing. But Eli was already moving, the old reflexes taking over as if 20 years had been 20 seconds. The bullet whined past his ear as he dove left, his Colt clearing leather with a speed that defied rational explanation. His return shot took Dawson in the chest, spinning the outlaw around and dropping him face first into the snow. The sight of their legendary quarry moving like liquid lightning sent a ripple of unease through the remaining gunmen, but discipline and greed held them in position. "Spread out!" Blackwood roared, drawing his own weapon. "Don't give him room to maneuver." But Eli was no longer where they expected him to be. Using Martha's strategic placement of garden walls and outbuildings, he'd already shifted position, appearing briefly in a doorway to drop another outlaw before vanishing again into the maze of cover she'd so carefully planned. From the greenhouse came the sharp crack of Tom's rifle, followed immediately by Jake's, despite his wounded arm. Willie's shotgun boomed like thunder, sending a load of buckshot into a cluster of mounted outlaws and scattering their horses in panic. The famous Colt spoke again, and Bull Morrison stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder and cursing in languages learned in frontier saloons and territorial prisons. The Phantom of Deadwood Canyon was keeping his promise, Every shot found its mark, every movement flowed with the deadly grace that had made him a legend. The gunfight raged across Martha's carefully tended gardens like a storm given human form, trampling flower beds that had taken decades to perfect and shattering the peaceful sanctuary she'd created from wilderness and hope. Eli moved through the chaos with the fluid grace of a man remembering skills he'd hoped never to use again, each shot deliberate and devastating. But 21 against 4 were still impossible odds, no matter how legendary one of the four might be. Jake had taken another bullet, this one in his leg, and was down behind an overturned wheelbarrow. Tom's rifle had gone silent after a near miss had forced him deeper into the greenhouse. Willie was holding his position by the root cellar entrance, but his ammunition was running low. "Getting tired, old man," Blackwood taunted from his cover behind the ranch house porch. He'd lost 6 men in the first 5 minutes of fighting, but that still left 15 guns against Eli's depleted forces. The insult might have stung once, but Eli was beyond such considerations now. He was operating in the space between heartbeats, where time moved like honey and every detail stood out with crystalline clarity. The smell of gunpowder and blood, the way snow melted where hot brass landed, the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead, all of it registered without conscious thought as he calculated angles and possibilities. His Colt spoke twice more, dropping another outlaw who'd tried to flank around the barn. 12 shots fired, 12 hits confirmed. Even after 20 years, the weapon felt like an extension of his will, responding to intention faster than thought. But as he reached for fresh ammunition, a rifle bullet shattered the window beside his head, sending glass cascading like deadly rain. More outlaws were moving to surround him, using their superior numbers to compress his area of maneuver. Soon there would be nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. The final confrontation came as he knew it must face to face with the man who'd traveled 20 years and uncounted miles to settle a debt written in blood and betrayal. Blackwood stepped out from behind the porch, his gun drawn but not yet aimed, his scarred face showing satisfaction at having finally cornered his quarry. "End of the line, Phantom," he said, savoring the moment. "No more tricks, no more running. Just you, me, and 20 years of waiting." They faced each other across Martha's rose garden, where she'd spent countless hours nurturing beauty from thorny stems and patient care. The irony wasn't lost on Eli that this place of creation should become the stage for destruction, that ground consecrated by love should be watered with violence. "You're right," Eli agreed, his voice carrying across the sudden stillness. Even the other outlaws had stopped shooting, recognizing the moment for what it was, the settling of accounts that had begun in a Deadwood saloon and would end beneath a Montana sky. Blackwood raised his weapon with theatrical slowness, enjoying his moment of triumph. "Any last words for the schoolmarm's grave?" The mention of Martha sent heat flooding through Eli's chest, but it wasn't the blind rage Blackwood had hoped to provoke. Instead, it was something purer, more focused, the crystallized essence of everything he'd learned about love and sacrifice and the things that made life worth defending. From the damaged house came a sound that stopped both men cold, the delicate melody of Martha's music box playing their wedding song. The mechanism must have been jarred by a stray bullet, its silver tines plucking out notes that spoke of spring mornings and whispered promises, and a love that had transformed a killer into something better. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Eli was back beneath the cottonwood tree on their wedding day, watching Martha's eyes shine with tears of joy as they spoke vows that would bind them together across decades and beyond death itself. He could hear her voice, gentle but certain, reminding him that some things were worth more than revenge, that mercy could be a greater victory than violence. His gun was already in his hand, hammer cocked and aimed center mass. One squeeze of the trigger would end Silas Blackwood forever, would balance the scales and close the book on 20 years of hatred. It would be justice, by any measure that mattered. But justice and righteousness weren't always the same thing. The music box continued its sweet melody, and in those notes, Eli heard Martha's final lesson that the man she'd fallen in love with wasn't the killer who'd ridden into her town, but the protector he'd chosen to become. That strength didn't always mean pulling the trigger, and victory didn't always require a body count. Blackwood saw the hesitation and snarled in triumph, bringing his own weapon to bear. But mercy didn't mean stupidity, and forgiveness didn't require martyrdom. Eli's shot took the outlaw leader in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying into the trampled snow. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader down and the legendary phantom still standing, began to throw down their weapons. Some fights could only end one way, and they were smart enough to recognize defeat when it stared them in the face with smoking Colts and eyes like winter ice. As the music box wound down to silence, Eli Rawlins stood victorious in his wife's ruined garden, having won the greatest battle of all, the one between the man he'd been and the man she'd helped him become. Spring came early to the Rawlins ranch that year, as if the earth itself were eager to heal the wounds winter had carved into its face. By March, the snow had retreated to the high peaks, revealing grass green as hope and wildflowers that painted the meadows with colors Martha would have loved. The cottonwood tree stood proud beside her grave, its branches thick with new buds that promised shade and shelter for seasons yet to come. Eli knelt in the soft earth beside the headstone, his hands black with soil, as he worked to plant the young sapling he'd nurtured through the cold months in Martha's greenhouse. The cutting had come from their original tree, a gift of life that would grow beside its parent and create a small grove where memory and hope could flourish together. "Figured you'd be here," Tom Rodriguez said, approaching across the fresh grass with the easy stride of a man whose shoulder had healed clean and strong. The foreman carried 2 cups of coffee and the morning mail, a routine they'd established over the long winter months as the ranch had slowly returned to something approaching normal. Eli accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how the steam rose like incense in the clear morning air. Simple pleasures had taken on new meaning since that December morning when violence had visited their sanctuary. Every peaceful dawn felt like a gift, every quiet evening like a promise kept. "Letter from the territorial marshal," Tom reported, settling on the wooden bench Eli had built beneath the tree. "Says Blackwood's made a full confession in exchange for life in prison instead of the rope. Cleared up about 20 unsolved cases across 3 territories. The outlaw leader had spent the winter in the territorial jail in Helena, his wounded shoulder healing slowly while lawyers debated his fate. Some of his surviving gang members had already been tried and sentenced, though most had received surprisingly light punishment in exchange for testimony about crimes stretching back decades. "What about the others?" Eli asked, thinking of the 4 men who'd thrown down their weapons that December morning and surrendered rather than face the phantom's guns. "Working," Tom replied with satisfaction. "Jake's got them cutting timber up north, earning honest wages for the first time in their lives. Says a couple of them might actually make decent hands if they stick with it." It had been Martha's idea, discovered in her journal after the shooting had ended. She'd written about the possibility of redemption for lost men, about the difference between justice and vengeance, about the healing that could come from useful work and patient guidance. Eli had decided to honor her vision by offering Blackwood's surviving followers a choice prison or a chance to earn their way to something better. Willie Patterson emerged from the main house, moving with the confident stride of a young man who'd faced down armed outlaws and discovered he was braver than he'd known. In the months since the gunfight, the boy had grown into someone Eli barely recognized, still eager and loyal, but tempered now by experience and responsibility. "Morning, Mr. Rawlins," Willie called, carrying a wooden crate that clinked with the sound of glass bottles. "Got those seedlings Mrs. Morrison ordered from back east. Says she wants to expand the medicinal herb garden this summer." Sarah Morrison had arrived in February, Jake's mail-order bride from Ohio, who'd taken one look at the damaged ranch and rolled up her sleeves to help restore it. She'd proven to have Martha's gift for making things grow, though her specialty was healing plants rather than flowers. The herb garden she'd started behind the main house was already showing promise. "Any word from town?" Eli asked, though he could guess the answer from Willie's grin. "Mr. Hendricks says the new schoolhouse should be finished by September," the young man reported, "and Miss Catherine accepted his proposal last Sunday after church. Whole town's talking about the wedding they're planning for June." Catherine Reeves had been Martha's closest friend, a woman who'd shared her passion for education and community service. Her engagement to the town's banker represented the kind of new beginning that would have made Martha smile. Life, Eli had learned, had a way of continuing even after the worst tragedies, finding ways to bloom again in soil that seemed too damaged to nurture growth. From his vest pocket, Eli withdrew a letter that had arrived the previous week, postmarked from a town in Oregon he'd never heard of. The handwriting was careful but unfamiliar, belonging to a woman who'd introduced herself as Martha's niece, Sarah, writing to express her condolences and share news that her own daughter was getting married in the fall. Asterisk, "Aunt Martha wrote to me often about the ranch and the life you'd built together." Asterisk, the letter said. Asterisk. She was so proud of everything you'd accomplished, but mostly she was proud of the man you'd become. If you ever find yourself wanting a change of scenery, you'd be welcome here. Family shouldn't be strangers, and Martha always said you were the finest man she'd ever known. Asterisk. The invitation had been on his mind for weeks, representing possibilities he hadn't considered in the dark months following Martha's death. The ranch would always be his home, but perhaps there were other places where an old gunfighter could find peace, other ways to honor the woman who'd saved his soul. As the sun climbed higher, painting the mountains with gold and shadow, Eli stood and brushed the soil from his hands. The young cottonwood stood straight and proud beside its parent, its roots already reaching deep into earth that had been consecrated by love and defended by courage. "Think she'd approve?" Willie asked, nodding toward the new tree. Eli smiled, feeling Martha's presence like sunshine on his face. She always said the best way to remember someone was to keep growing the things they loved. In the distance, a train whistle echoed off the mountains, carrying the promise of journeys yet to be taken and lives yet to be lived. The phantom of Deadwood Canyon was finally, truly dead, buried not by bullets or time, but by the understanding that some battles were won not through violence, but through the simple choice to become something better. The cottonwood trees stood together in the morning light, old and new, past and future, testament to the truth that love, like hope, had roots deeper than winter and branches that reached toward endless sky.